For the past couple of days, I've been talking about games that were announced at Nintendo's Direct Mini presentation that took place on June 28th. The games I've talked about so far have been Super Bomberman R2, Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection. I talked about the Persona series. I talked about the Mario Rabbids Sparks of Hope game that's supposed to be coming out for Nintendo Switch. Another game that stood out to me during Nintendo's Direct presentation was Pac-Man World Re-Pack. And as a lot of you know, this game is supposed to be a remake of the Pac-Man World game that came out back in 1999 for the PS1. That game was actually one of the better 3D Pac-Man games that had been released within the past 25 years. And a lot of people will go on record and tell you that there aren't too many good, Pac-Man 3D games that are out there because some people feel like the Pac-Man series had drifted too far away from its original identity in terms of being a simple maze game, but it is what it is. I mean, I know the Pac-Man series arguably peaked back in like the 80s when, arcade games in general were very popular, but, the series had to evolve over time, and I feel like this game, Pac-Man World, the original version of, Pac-Man World, it was one of the games that was 3D that basically, it basically represented what the series had become up until that point. And yeah, the series has evolved more and more over time, but it seemed like the more the Pac-Man series evolved, it seemed like the more, or I guess the less people paid attention to it. But I don't think it's because like the Pac-Man games have gotten worse or anything like that. It's just that there's a lot of competition out there in terms of video games. Like you look at Pac-Man World, which came out back in 1999 for the PS1. There were so many games for the PS1 during the mid to late 90s that overshadowed this title. You had games like Tekken 2 and 3. You had Final Fantasy 7. You had Gran Turismo. You had Crash Bandicoot. You had Spyro the Dragon. The list goes on in terms of games that overshadowed Pac-Man World that came out back in 1999, and despite that, it actually did pretty well in terms of sales. I believe it reached over 1 million copies in terms of sales. I'm not exactly sure what the exact number is, but Pac-Man World was actually a commercial success. And the plot for Pac-Man World actually has some interesting elements to it in terms of I guess storytelling, because the plot is very basic, but at the same time, it's different than what you see in older like 2D Pac-Man games that really don't have a plot. It just has an objective they have to complete. Basically, in Pac-Man World, players have to rescue family members of Pac-Man after they got kidnapped by Ghost during his birthday party, which is kind of screwed up, but it is what it is. And just looking at the gameplay and, the level designs and all that stuff looked very impressive. And honestly, it's amazing that, that over 20 years later that this game is actually being remade for current and last generation game systems. As a matter of fact, Pac-Man World probably should have been remade and re-released like 10 years ago or what have you, but I guess now it's better than never. And, Pac-Man World Re-Pack is basically the remake of Pac-Man World. It's going to be on the PS5, PS4, Xbox Series X, Xbox One, PC, and Nintendo Switch. And a lot of people are questioning whether or not Bandai Namco plans on doing the same thing for Pac-Man World 2 sometime in the future. But I really think it depends on how well Pac-Man World Re-Pack does on a commercial level. Seeing how like the Pac-Man series is not nearly as popular as it was 20 years ago or as popular as it was back in the 80s, because when you think of Pac-Man, people think of like the original arcade classic that came out back in the 80s. And back then Pac-Man was very simple. It was basically a maze game that just got more and more difficult as you progressed throughout each level. And to some people, having things simple and basic is I think it's the best thing for them. It's something that they like about certain video game franchises, and other people just don't like complexity. And the more you take something basic, the more you try to evolve it over time, the less people dislike it, and the less casuals care. Not necessarily because it's a bad thing, but because there's more, video game franchises that are emerging each year and each decade, and certain genres become less popular and certain genres become more popular. And nowadays, genres like RPG, action adventure, what have you, they're more popular than the maze genre. And Pac-Man World is not necessarily a maze game. It looks more like a action adventure type game or just an action game. And I do feel that Pac-Man World remake will definitely appeal to old school gamers, those who were fans of the Pac-Man series in the past, those who played the original version of Pac-Man World back in the late 90s. I'm not exactly sure how well this game will do in terms of sales and how well it'll do on a commercial level, but depending on how well this game does following its upcoming release in August of this year, I think Bandai Namco should definitely consider remastering or remaking more 3D Pac-Man games, because I do feel that Pac-Man is a big enough franchise to a point where people, casuals, people who've never even played a Pac-Man game, they know what it is and they would look at it and they'd be interested in seeing what it's like. So we're just gonna have to see how well this game does in terms of sales once it's released in August. And if this game does pretty good, hopefully we get more 3D Pac-Man games remade a little bit later in the future.